Thank you very much. Before we start, I'm going to read a short statement. The views and opinions expressed today do not represent or reflect the views and opinions of Loyola University administrators, faculty, or staff. Today, I'm going to be co-moderators will be Courtney Hutchings. Before we start with the introductions, I'd like to sort of set a little bit of a stage for what we're going to talk about today. Back in 1948, the United Nations declared that education is a fundamental human right that is essential for achieving human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted again in 1948 and states that everyone has a right to education. And we know that they were ahead of their time, so to speak, and that education impacts poverty, gender equity, child protection, sustainable development, critical thinking, and action-related events. So our discussion today will build upon what was declared as a human right back in 1948. So I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Courtney Hutchings. He's the first-generation college graduate and Ronald E. McNair Scholar, currently an assistant professor of higher education at Northern Illinois University. Their research focuses on the academic and social experiences of Black, gay, bisexual, queer, and non-binary students, as well as student affairs professionals. They also explore student experiences with substance use and recovery using critical qualitative methodologies. Courtney's work has appeared in several prestigious journals, including the Journal of College Student Development and the Journal of Higher Education.
Asher Beltran, my apologies, is the Assistant Vice President for Diversity and Student Engagement, overseeing the Centers for Diversity and Inclusion, Student Engagement, and Black Student Excellence. She collaborates with the Vice President for Student Development on diversity and inclusion initiatives and leads the DSD Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Sense of Belonging Committee. Her previous roles includes positions in student activities, graduate student life, and the Deans of Student Office. And before joining Loyola, she worked in sorority and fraternity life at Baylor University. Asher holds a BA from Western Illinois University and an MSCD from the University of Kansas, and she currently is pursuing a PhD in higher education administration at Loyola. Yay. Dr. Charles Tocci is an associate professor of education at Loyola University Chicago with extensive experience in curriculum development, teaching, and educational research. He holds an EDD in curriculum teaching and an MED in anthropology and education from the Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Tocci has published in many articles and book chapters on topics like teacher preparation, educational policy, and nonviolence pedagogy. He has also received several awards, including the Loyola Distinguished Faculty Award for Excellence in Teaching. Currently, he is actively involved in projects that addresses social studies education, school policing, and civic engagement. Dr. Rufus R. Gonzales is a licensed clinical psychologist and a clinical associate professor at Loyola University Chicago with over 20 decades of experience in multicultural counseling, clinical supervision, and mental health training. He holds a PhD in counseling psychology from Loyola University Chicago, specializing in multicultural counseling and consultation. Dr. Gonzales maintains a private practice and serves as a consulting psychologist with a focus on trauma, anxiety, and diverse populations. His work has earned him numerous awards, including the Marjorie Culver Center Outstanding Service Award for Training in Psychotherapy with Torture Survivors in 2023.
Thank you very much, Courtney. To get us going, and this question is for the panel, please discuss whether education is a privilege or a human right. Also, what does it mean when we talk about education being a fundamental human right?
You got to pitch that at someone specific. It appears too polite to start. I don't know that this is the right place to start the response to this question, but it is the thing that I was thinking. That, David, you already pinned the UN Declaration of Human Rights to 1948, which to me is important because historically it places the articulation of education as a human right with the post-World War II emerging Western consensus that at least part of the world should be developed in the image of Western European and North American democratic societies. And that means education looks like schooling. And specifically when the UN talks about these things, really basic primary schooling, free, accessible, state-sponsored. But that's still a very new conception of what education is. And it really focuses on the individual's right to be educated and doesn't focus as well on a community's right to educate its young people, right? Education goes back as far as human civilization goes, and formal institutions of education stretch back just as far. There's always been traditions, places, practices of educating young people into society and preparing them to be members of those societies. And part of what we've done in the human rights era is sort of narrowly tailor what education as a human right looks like. And I'm really interested in trying to imagine and think about what the other side of that would look like, what it would look like to imagine a collective and communal right to education, and really put upon our states a vision of supporting, resourcing, and equipping communities to develop educational institutions for their young people.
I think going off of that, the question is it a privilege or human right? So by law, it's a human right, but is that really put into action? Or is it a privilege? And I come more from the higher education lens. And even within that act, it's mostly free elementary education and then higher education by merit. But also, how did we get to merit, right? Where's the access to what type of schooling K through 12 did a student receive that they maybe could be at a merit compared to another institution that has way more resources? And so from there, it might not be the right. It might be the privilege that you had to go to certain schools or that you were able to live in certain areas that had more resources, things like that. And so it's also, yes, it's a human right, but do we actually put that into action for all of the human beings in this, and we're speaking of this country at the moment, but we can even see that within the world. And then how does that connect to your own human right? And so connecting to human rights of being able to live, and education is connected to that. And I know we'll touch on that a little bit more later on. But then within that, I think some folks don't see it as a human right. They just see it as a privilege, especially in the higher education, with the affordability of education in this country and the lack of affordability, actually.
I was going to say, I agree with Astrid. I think that why can't it actually be both? It is by definition a human right, but the systems that support education are not always equitable. They're inequitable. And so different people get different kinds of education, and not everyone gets education or different levels of education. And so those who do have the ability to be educated have a responsibility. There's a responsibility that's associated with that privilege to use the privilege of the education to change the system and to address the inequities that are present. That's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, I often think about the ways around how this connects to access. So I often think about is while education can either be privilege or a human right, but also think about the ways around who has the access to engage and be in spaces in education, whether that's secondary education, but I often think about my work as a higher ed scholar, that often higher education is also seen as a barrier where it may be accessible, but also may not be affordable, right? And so we often tend to think about, while these things may be a privilege to be a part of these educational spaces, not everyone is also able to have access to higher education. There's also spaces around lack of affordability. There's also spaces around what does that mean for folks who are communities that are on the margins. So we think about folks from working class, lower middle class, or even different socioeconomic statuses. That also does also play a crucial role in a lot of ways of how do we think about, even though it's a human right, those folks may not also be able to access education. And so I think we need to be very, very intentional about breaking down those barriers, breaking down those margins as well.
I think that's a good segue into our next question that we have. And we are, again, going to touch on some of these things as we progress through the evening.
Thank you. Astrid, how does education impact human rights? For example, how does education address poverty, girls and women, discrimination, and so on?
Mm-hmm. I think we touched a little bit on it, but to talk about human rights is, the right to live, to the right for equal pay, the right for liberty and security, but also education can impact that, right? Because in this country, we know that certain educational level can get you to a higher level of liberty, of success, of security, of equal pay. I mean, even I, as a woman, might have the same education of a man, but might not have the same pay in the same role. So we still see that it impacts, it could positively impact, but it also might not make even a difference. Or I think of even something that Courtney and Rufus was actually saying a little bit ago of the structures that we have in place and dismantling them. And it's also the education. I even remember as a little girl being in trouble in second grade for speaking Spanish in class, right? And from that, the teacher was like, I remember as a second grader believing that I couldn't go to college because of my identity as a Latina. And so right there, the educational system and the folks within it already thinking I'm not able to get to that place, right? But in my home, it was, since I was a little girl, you're getting your PhD. And so I think those impacts of human rights connect with your ability, it can get you to a different place. But it's not to get the money, it's not this, it's also like a member of society within that. And having the right of education, if you so choose for it, so that you're able to get out of poverty, if that is your reasoning there, if it is to have that formal education, connecting as young women and girls of what does that look like of gender roles and what does that play within education within that, so that I think it impacts human rights, especially all around the world.
Let's see if we can go just a little deeper in terms of that was a great response, Astrid. Can we go a little deeper and talk about sort of an action aspect of this? And what can we do as educators, and what kind of things should we be doing to put things in action to address, poverty, gender inequity, and those kinds of things? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think one of the first things is to actually recognize that it exists and that it's happening. And so wherever you are at, like I am administrator here at Loyola, recognizing there, but if I was a teacher of second grade and K through 12 in school, to recognize and to see, so to have a critical lens of something. And it doesn't mean that it is, I think sometimes the critical lens gets a bad rap of like, you're already going against it or you're already complaining. It's just to see it critically, because we're always trying to improve and to be the best that we can for our students. And so it's first to just recognize and have that lens and sit back and reflect, even within the Jesuit values of reflection, of taking a moment to pause and to see and to ask the questions and to reflect. I think that's a first step. And from there, be able to get with the community that is impacted to see what is the best way of action from there. And that might be different in different settings and your positionality as well, but them creating that team to find what is the best way to dismantle this that is currently impacting the students.
Courtney, who's responsible for ensuring the right to education is upheld?
I feel like that is a very complex and convoluted question, because I often think about the ways around how power and privilege and oppression often plays a crucial role in the ways around how education is operated, how it operationalized, how it's taught. So who also gets the opportunity to teach within classrooms. So whether we think about from K through 12, or we also think about in higher education. I myself, as a higher ed faculty member, I often think about it's a responsibility and a right. And I think that we often have to think about not only who's responsible, but who's responsive to holding education. And so I think about this work, I think, in the context of the classroom. And so oftentimes when I'm teaching in the classroom, I tell students that this is the most radical space when we think about Bell Hooks's work, the most radical space that happens in the classroom. The most radical possibilities that can happen in the classroom. And so I often think about the classroom space as not only as a think tank, but as the possibilities to see that every single person in the classroom is an educator. It's not just a teacher who's educating. I often see myself as a facilitator, and I often tell my students that they are the facilitators as well. And so how do us as a collective talk about education and all of its human rights, but often who gets a chance to forward those conversations?
I really like that perspective, in that as educators, our students we help them become active in terms of their citizenship, and they become individuals who can help with education reform and help us move in those directions. So I really like that aspect of thinking about social change on a generational basis. So I don't know if anybody else had thoughts or comments on that.
To me, the question of who enforces our human rights, who ensures that they're upheld, is the fundamental question. I mean, for the the UN, who sponsored the Universal Declaration, who runs the Commission for Refugees, that developed the Millennium Development Goals, which states primary education, right? Who's taken this banner internationally to lead on this. But we sit here today and there are no functioning schools in Palestine, right? All of the universities in Gaza have been destroyed. There are tens of millions, probably in excess of 100 million young people in the world who have no access to even primary education. And there are rights so their human right can't be met. And there really is no enforcement mechanism to ensure that. We even see this much more closely to home, where young people who are provided inadequate education or who are pushed out of school have very little recourse to actually get high quality education through systemic means, through our state governments and through our federal governments. To put a different angle on that, here in the States, we have no federal right to an education, and only about a third of the states have a state level right to an education. And even that's very murky. Here in Illinois, our state constitution reads that all Illinois residents have the right to a free public K-12 education financed by the state and to the limits of their abilities, whatever it means to go educate someone, to the limits of their capabilities. But these things are so hazily defined, and there are so few institutions that we can put our finger on to actually enforce them and to make sure those rights are protected and enacted, that education as a human right is much more an ideal than it is a practice at the moment. And I think when I look at our institutions, especially our higher ed institutions, as places to advance human rights, when we see our students protesting for Palestine, start creating encampments, pushing our institutions to create leverage, to make change, to try to find places to enforce those rights. I see a different possibility for the right to education, and that's using our institutions to enforce that internationally and for those who don't have that recourse otherwise.
One thing, just in response to that, though, is some institutions don't see education just as a human right, but they also see it as a weapon or as a political tool. So one of the things that some of the clients that we see at the Kovler Center are refugees from Cameroon, and there's a region in Cameroon that speaks English, but it's controlled by a French-speaking government, and there are protesters who want to secede, but in protesting, the French government has come and shut down all the schools, bombed some of the schools, and those protesters have been kidnapped and have had horrible things happen to them, and then they seek asylum and they come to the U.S. and other countries. That's just one case where educational systems are used as a weapon, or it even happens here in the U.S. It was in a dissertation proposal last week, and the student was talking about the lack of LGBT curriculum in higher education, but was also talking about how there's a ban on queer curriculum in K through 12 education in 7 states. There's restriction on another 7 states in the U.S. So education can be used politically as well. So it depends on how people are viewing it.
It's interesting that the question is who is responsible. And so we've talked about systems, but behind those systems are people. And those people can all have a different way of thought, a different way of being, and a different interpretation of the exact same phrase or law or act or ruling, whatever it might be. And it's interesting because then that goes from education, right? They all formed that in some way, whether it's formal education, informal education of society, their home, the culture, whatever it might be. So it's kind of like this interesting cycle of its people and whatever form of education they receive or way of thought or values and beliefs. So it's who, but really it's also love. It's also those values of like love and education. I think love and education can solve this whole world's problems. And so, but everyone's interpretation of that could be different, and that's where we collide. And that is where we're still at today. And that's why we have some of the injustice and the separations and the fractures of these systems. So it's also interesting. It's people, which we're also not perfect as human beings. And so it's interesting, just that cycle that you can see.
Thank you. Next question, Charles. This is for Charles. Help us understand the difference between education as a human right and education as reform. What are the fundamental differences?
I think my response here overlaps with some of what we've just discussed as well. We've articulated and explored some of the elements of education as a human right. Education as reform really considers the institutions of education as these layered spaces with which to realize that human right. So if education is a human right, schooling is a place where that right is realized, where that right is addressed. It's all schooling, especially when you look at the Universal Declaration, schooling is also considered as fundamental to all of the other human rights. It's where we learn about what our human rights are. It's where we get skills and knowledge to be able to realize those things within our societies, and a place to develop and advocate for more rights. And then third, as I was articulating a moment ago, our education institutions are placed to pursue our rights or pursue the rights on behalf of others, trying to sort of wield the tools of the institution or direct our institution to expand human rights or provide those opportunities for others. So within an institution of schooling, within one institution or within schooling as a general, we have these layered and interrelated places of human rights. And that makes it complex. but it also means that the work we do within schools provides us with a vantage point to address all of these different areas, to provide us with reach that goes well beyond what we can do immediately, whether it's through our students and that sort of generational change that we were just talking about, or trying to influence the direction of our institutions. If in higher education, that might be how we partner with or work with other institutions internationally, how we use our endowments or not use our endowments, and think about who we bring in to our institution. Again, to connect back to Palestine, with untold numbers of displaced young people, displaced university students, displaced scholars, I think it is incumbent upon an institution like Loyola with an explicit mission, social justice mission, to proactively seek out, bring in, and give home to people whose right to education has been physically demolished. That is a productive and meaningful role that we should be playing in this moment.
I really like how you included the example of talking about the Palestinians, and that kind of leads me to something I was thinking as a follow-up question about integrating human rights into education, into different curriculum subjects. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do. I just wondered if there's, with the panel, if there's any case studies or relevant examples of human rights abuses or to promote our understanding of the discussion that we're having today. If anything kind of resonates with you, or if I know some of you have talked about this and incorporated it into your curriculum, is there any examples that you've used in the past that might resonate with us? Or current things that are going on?
I think I can share at least, because it's actually fresh in my mind. This fall semester, I'm teaching a college student development theory course, and we have a lot of international students in my class. And during the first week of class, I did an activity with students where I had them revamp, I call it a syllabus remix. And so what I did is I asked questions around, do you all see yourselves as folks with different intersectional identities reflected in the curriculum? And from there, some students said that we want to have certain things shift and change. And I said, well, what would that look like? What would that feel like? And actually, I came in my classroom with one syllabus, and I would say probably about an hour and a half into the class, I had to completely rip up the syllabus and retool it. And to me, that was really important because I wanted students to also understand that they saw themselves in the courses and the readings. And I asked students if they wanted podcasts or if they wanted different type of multimedia pieces in the curriculum. And after I revamped the course, I sat with them the following week and said, here's the new syllabus. I want folks to share and talk to me about how they see themselves reflected in this space again. And I thought it was really important that me as a professor take away that control and that power in terms of creating the course. I said, I can create a class for you all, but you also, if you don't see yourselves in it, you're not going to engage in the learning. You're not going to engage in the critical conversations. You're not even going to want to come to class. You're not maybe want to even read or listen to any of the content. And so I think it's really important for us to look at the syllabus, because the syllabus is a living document. It's not a fixed document. And we often have to think about the ways around how course readings and course content also needs to reflect the students who are part of that class. So we're going to move on to the next question. Rufus, you've worked for several years with torture survivors at the Clover Center. Please talk about how political motivated human rights violations impact individuals' ability to access education. Also, please share a few inspirational stories of people you've worked with and the students you've worked with throughout the years.
Sure. Human rights are about access and about about functional and emotional and psychological capacity and freedom, right? So if you are, sorry, I'm nervous. God, I'm drawing a blank. I'm so sorry. So with the okay. So I just have to think. I have to. Okay. I don't know. It's something about this setup with these huge microphones in our faces and all of you out there that is just feels artificial. You know why? Because it is artificial. So I work at the Kovler Center. It's this wonderful organization. It's been around since the 80s. It works, it started off working with torture survivors, survivors of political human rights violations, adult survivors. There's also a program for refugees from Afghanistan and child trauma survivors as well. It's an agency that has a holistic approach. It works with the participants psychologically, medically, legally, socially. It really takes care of the people who come through the system. They've been hurt in so many ways. And when you work with the clients there, you really start to understand a more broad picture of, or at least I started to understand a more broad picture of the experience of people around the world who don't have human rights, who don't have the experiences that I grew up with here in the US. So governments, or the participants at the Kovler Center often experience a lack of human rights, a lack of humanity, structurally and systemically, like the anecdote I told earlier about Cameroon. Governments intentionally and purposefully try to restrict education. Another example would be like the Taliban restricting secondary education of women. It's intentional, right? Other ways that governments do it are systematic on a more global level or population level, but it's not necessarily targeting education. It just is targeting poverty or keeping someone oppressed more globally, and it impacts people's ability to receive education. But human rights are also then violated individually, and that's where issues of torture come in, or issues of human rights being violated at the individual level. And those happen before the participants come to the United States. But then also there is a lack of ability to the right of education when they get to the United States, because their whole lives have been interrupted. They are torn from their country. Have a forced migration experience. They come to the U.S. and then have a cultural experience with education that's very different. The goals are different, the structure's different, the language is different. The children, when they get here, they have to form relationships with peers in a whole different way. And so there are so many things that are going on for the parents that education sometimes is really important, but it's not always the top priority for what they're struggling with. So the supports that they get through the Kovler Center are so meaningful. There was an experience that I had working with one of the participants at the Kovler Center that really was directly related to educational experiences that I think was pretty meaningful for him and meaningful for me to be with him in that experience. I supervise graduate students there. And this participant, we use the term participant, client, pretty much interchangeably. He came to the U.S. when he was in his late teens, finished high school here. He fled his home country because of his sexuality. He was able to actually enroll in post-secondary education in college. He became a participant at the Kovler Center, and I supervised his first therapist. And so I got to know a lot about him, but I never actually met him. And then when his therapist ended her training and she left, I then supervised his next therapist. And so I got to know even more about him and his experience. So I was with him for 2 years. And then that was during his junior year of college. And he, at that point, was deciding that he wanted to go to med school, which was pretty rare for the participants in this program, because it's not something that they're usually able to achieve. And I was asked to do an assessment on him so that he could receive accommodations because of his trauma history and because of PTSD. So I was actually able to finally meet him for the first time, and it was a virtual meeting, but I met with him for several meetings. He was very grateful. We completed the assessment. I wrote it up, and then he was granted the accommodations. They weren't fully granted, but we got some of the accommodations, and he was able to take the exam. But then this past summer, the Kovler Center sponsors an event every year. It's the UN International Day of Remembrance for Torture Survivors. We actually host it at Loyola. We host it every year. And he was one of the speakers there. And he got up, and he is this amazing, vibrant, just joyous man. He was just so grateful to the organization and to be able to say that he was out and gay and that he was going to med school. And then he shared, which I didn't know why he wanted to go to med school. He shared that he wanted to go to med school because as a torture survivor, you have a very complex relationship with your body. And when you go through the process of applying for asylum, you have to go through a forensic examination of your body to confirm that the injuries you have and the scars that you have are consistent with the trauma you're saying that you have endured. And it's really a very vulnerable experience. And he had a positive experience with the physician who gave him the medical examination. And the physician was very kind and conducted it in a way that he felt was respectful of him. And so he wanted to go to medical school so that he could become a physician and do the same thing for other torture survivors and other trauma survivors. And to hear him say that in that space was just amazing. And afterwards, he came up and he introduced himself to me in person for the first time and gave me a big hug and thanked me for the role that I played in that part. And that was just an amazing experience to see how much he was supported by that organization and to know that he was able to move through that. And his journey is not over, but to know that he was able to have that experience. So that was one pretty amazing experience. I had another I could share, but I'm not sure if there's time. Yeah. There was another experience that I had with a client. It's not so much educationally related, but it was the time that I wrote my first affidavit with a client at the Kovler Center. Writing an affidavit is similar to a forensic exam. It's a psychological affidavit that attests to the person's trauma history and their experience that is used in their asylum court case to verify that they are currently suffering and what their psychological state is, and that the psychological state that they currently have is consistent, again, with the story that they've shared. And it's often highly regarded and weighted in the court proceedings because people who are not mental health professionals and don't often understand that trauma symptoms and the trauma response doesn't manifest in the way that you would think it would. So when someone has a traumatic experience, something that's horrific, they might look or feel disconnected. They might forget things that were really terrible. Their memory doesn't work the way that typical memories work. The timeline of things is difficult for them to remember. And so if you're talking to them, they may seem like they don't really know what happened, or something that sounds like it would be really terrible to them might just seem kind of ambivalent. And so you might think that they're lying, or you might think that they don't really know what they're talking about, or that it wasn't as bad as it was. And so these affidavits are written by a mental health professional as a way to say, no, this is normal, this is typical, this is what the brain does, so that the judge and the lawyers can verify that what the participant went through is in some ways true or valid. So there's a lot of pressure when these things are written. And it was the first time that I had written one. And the participants know that these documents are really meaningful and really important. So there's a lot of anxiety over the putting together of these documents. And they have to be consistent with all of the documents that have already been written, and all of the reports that they've already given verbally, and all of the other court records that are in place. So when you write them, you have to make sure that you have all of the details down, but it's very, very vulnerable and difficult to go over all of those details with someone who's had such a difficult trauma experience. The client that I was working with had a very complex case. He had a torture event, and after that torture event, he was separated from his wife, who was pregnant, and they both had to be on the run. They were both being hunted down after that. They were separated and ran to different countries. And so all of the details about timelines and places and what happened afterwards had to be really detailed, and the experience had to be described over a long period of time. We had multiple sessions to put the timeline together. And so I was very cognizant of not putting pressure on him to talk about more than he was able to or wanted to, but he knew that it was something that was important. When I was finally done with the report, I was really nervous about sharing it with him. And we knew that it was going to be the day that I was going to share the report with him. And so, and it's a long report, it's like 20 pages long, but it's important for him to read it, to verify everything and make sure it was all accurate. And so we sat down, I handed him the report, and he sat there and he read it, and it felt like it was forever that he was reading it. And it was just silence between the two of us, right? And I could see some emotion on his face, and I could see some tears welling up, and that was a little alarming to me. And then when he was done, he started to cry, and I started to panic internally. And then he had a smile on his face, and he said, "You understand me. You really understood what happened to me." And then I started to cry. And it was so validating for him to see in this one document this whole timeline of terrible experiences that he had not gone through in his mind consecutively in years. He had been so afraid of putting it all together. It had been so horrible, but he was able to put it all together in bits and pieces in a safe space. And then reading it all together, he felt seen in being able to put it together with someone he felt safe and trusted. And that was such an honor for me. And I was just, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful moment. And he got asylum.
Thanks for sharing, Rufus. Two amazing stories, actually. We have about 10 minutes left, maybe less. So I think we have room for one or two more questions.
So I have a question for the panelists. As we discuss, infringements and violations of the rights to education continue to persist. Besides financial barriers, what other barriers exist, and how should we address them? So kind of thinking about things that have happened in education, such as the teacher shortage, untrained teachers, when we think about things about unsafe learning environments that bring up conflict, whether that's in the classroom or other spaces around climate change. We're curious to hear folks' thoughts.
I think going off of what you just shared, yes, the shortage of teachers. I also think of the education of teachers, and I'm in the education of college students. I'm in the developmental stages of students, but I think Loyola does a great job of really looking at education in a critical lens and teaching the student their students who are future teachers and future practitioners and future therapists. But I don't know if in this country all schools do that, right? And prepare our students, our future educators, which I think we all are educators in this world, but formal educators, to really think of every student in the classroom, their identities, the intersectionality of their identities, what has influenced their way of learning, what ways of teaching that will impact and make the most difference in all students, or having to shift things, the cultural lenses that now we're in the United States are even more the cultures within this country. And so even looking into that, all that I said takes work and time and energy. And we all know how much teachers get paid in this country, right? And so, but I think that sometimes is a barrier to our students, right? Of even just how are we preparing our teachers and our educators, our administrators to dismantle those systems, to see that, to do, to really think of every student that they're serving. And I would say that for the higher ed world as well, though, too.
And maybe to go along with that, one of the things that we talk about a lot recently in the world of psychology is decolonizing psychology, which means not ascribing to all that we have ascribed to in the history of psychology and taking it apart and not believing it just because it's what we've always been told, but making it relevant to the people in the communities we work with and going beyond individual therapy, but getting out in the world and doing things like advocacy and getting into the community and being a part of the communities we work with. So that's part of the education and needing to make sure that we emphasize that with the students that we do educate.
I'm I don't know if I'm a skeptic, a cynic, a pessimist. I don't know what I am, but I look ahead and I see that there will always be infringements. There will always be barriers. There will always be violations of human rights, and there will always be intentional systems that prevent our young people from being educated, from attaining an education. So on the one hand, it makes me reflect on Jesuit history and how through the 17th and 18th century, the Jesuits were some of the largest slaveholders in the Western Hemisphere. Like, that is part of our inheritance. And as recently as 1838, Georgetown University held slaves. I guess I said the wrong thing. That must be taboo. Start coming for the Jesuits, and they, and so that's part of our inheritance, that we as members of a Jesuit institution inherit that history, and we carry that with us. And so it's incumbent upon us, with that same Jesuit mission, it's incumbent upon us to repair those injustices, to really think deeply about how they continue to manifest and what world that has created, and how that aligns with our values or not, and how that aligns with our actions or not. Another touch point for me with this is the Wounded Angel statue on the West Quad up on the Lakeshore campus. That's the circular statue that was designed and then brought to our campus that commemorates the assassination of 6 El Salvadorian Jesuits and 2 civilians in 1989, as they advocated for the poor in El Salvador during the Civil War. And to me, that makes concrete this institution, Loyola University Chicago's mission to be in solidarity with those in suffering. And the Wounded Angel in its prominent place on our campus, right where our students were organizing protests in favor of Palestine and many other protests over the years here, that is a concrete manifestation of our ethical obligation here, and that we need to cultivate community here, which is perpetually seeking out the barriers, the infringements, and really holding each other to take action in solidarity so that we might overcome those, to find new and novel ways to overcome these barriers and infringements as they emerge. And that's kind of the privilege we have here, but also this historical inheritance we have as a Jesuit institution to perpetually push ourselves and each other forward like that.
Let's go a little deeper when we discuss advocacy. Who should be involved in advocacy work? And more importantly, where have we failed when it comes to where have advocates failed historically when it comes to related to education as a basic human right?
When you ask the question, who should be involved in advocacy, I almost think of every human, right? Like we all play a role in this to educate our society, right? And if we think that we're on this world to be with our siblings, then you would want that sibling to have that right of education. You would want them to have that right of proper access to higher education. And so we might all have different positionality and different ways of that, but I think we all play a role in advocating for the right of education for our society. And I would say that around the world. The moment where we don't see that, then I think we're not really then creating a just world for all. And so, and going back to our Jesuit values and Catholic social teaching of seeing everyone with human dignity. And so I think we all play a role, whether we realize that or not, and we might even play a role against the advocacy in certain ways that we show up or not vote or not XYZ. And so I think those are the folks to be involved, and we fail when we don't see that, and sometimes we're too tired, or sometimes we just, we don't see the way to that light that maybe one day there will be no barriers. But if we get one step closer, and everyone does their step one step closer, then there maybe could be a brighter future.
I often think about the folks who we fail. Like I often think about the advocates that we often may have well intentions, but the impact really harms the folks that we're trying to support and advocate for. So I often think about communities on the margins that are in education that often are even pushed out of education or not even seen as given a second chance. So a lot of my research work falls around folks in recovery. And I often think about folks in recovery that often are not given second chances. So I think about folks who have navigated substance abuse and have been forced out of higher education, or even forced out of education, or even not even allowed to be asked back into education. And so I often think about folks who identify as trans and queer and folks who are sex workers. Those different communities and folks on the margins often we talk about advocacy, but we often create a box in what that advocacy looks like. And if it doesn't look the ways around how society deems as folks as recoverable or folks as seen as the good people, we often push them not only past the margin, we don't even give them access in order to be in educational spaces. And so I'm often thinking about what is the role of not only folks in education, but even folks outside of education in terms of what does that advocacy look and feel like.
Thank you so much. I think we have about 2 minutes left. Just wanted to see if the panel had any final comments, thoughts they wanted to share tonight.
I would share that in a Jesuit tradition of reflection, that even myself reflecting on what we've all shared here of what our role can be from this, right? What action can we go into, or just taking that moment to reflect and pause, and to then be able to see, okay, what can I do with this? How can I get into a team? You don't have to do this alone, or the educational system isn't one person, right? And so I think just even that component of taking some time to reflect, to pause, and then be able to energize, to continue the work to provide a good education for all human beings.
Amen.
So first, I would like to, just thank the panelists for being here in the space today and sharing your thoughts and your stories and reflections. We also would like to thank Reed, Elizabeth, and Matt, as well as our student worker, Stella, for staying late and organizing tonight's podcast. Finally, I want to thank Nancy for all of her excellent work on developing the panel, coordination, and vision for tonight's podcast.
Yes.
And let's thank our excellent hosts of the
Yes,
podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you.